At first, the men guarding the compound heard only the dogs. Then came the rotors. Not the slow, distant beat of Syrian aircraft, not the sound of a helicopter circling high above the desert. This was lower, closer. Several machines, arriving together through the darkness, so fast that the warning and the attack seemed to become the same event. It was shortly after midnight, on the 16th of May, 2015 near Al-Amr in eastern Syria. The compound belonged to a senior Islamic State official known as Abu Sayyaf. Around it stood armed guards, walls, buildings, and the open desert of Deir ez-Zor. Inside were computers, telephones, account books, weapons, women held in captivity, and one of the most valuable men in the organization's hidden economy. The guards had been told that the Americans fought from the sky. They had watched coalition aircraft strike from altitudes they could not reach. They knew the sound of jets and the white flash of a missile. Distance was part of the pattern. Distance was what made the enemy predictable. But that night, the distance vanished. American commandos came out of the darkness and entered the compound on foot. According to the United States government, Islamic State fighters engaged them at close range. Abu Sayyaf was killed. His wife, Sayyaf, was captured. A young Yazidi woman being held as a slave was rescued. No American was killed. The official announcement offered numbers, names, and outcomes. It did not publish a dramatic confession from a surviving guard. There is no reliable transcript in which an Islamic State fighter delivers the perfect sentence demanded by a film trailer. Most of the men who faced the assault force did not live to describe it. Yet the organization did speak. It spoke through the calls made when the aircraft appeared, through the positions its fighters chose, through the documents they tried to protect, through the prisoners who later described its security system, and above all, through what happened after the commandos disappeared back into the night. The message was not complicated. They had believed the desert protected them. They had believed darkness belonged to them. They were wrong. To understand why this single raid mattered, we must return to the world Islamic State had built around Al-Amr. In the spring of 2015, the group controlled large areas of Syria and Iraq. It collected taxes, sold oil, seized property, trafficked antiquities, and treated human beings as merchandise. Its propaganda showed columns of vehicles moving in daylight, courts operating in captured towns, and fighters posing beside black flags. It wanted the world to see a state. Behind those images was a bureaucracy. Oil wells had to be counted. Drivers had to be paid. Smugglers had to be trusted, threatened, or replaced. Refineries needed spare parts. Local emirs demanded their share. Money crossed front lines through middlemen who might sell to anyone. Every barrel produced a trail of names, quantities, permissions, and debts. Abu Sayyaf stood close to that trail. American officials described him as a senior figure involved in the group's oil and gas operations, finances, and military activity. His real identity was reported under different names, a common problem in an organization built on aliases. What mattered was his access. He was not simply a man carrying a rifle. He was a junction between the battlefield and the balance sheet. That made him useful alive. The mission was therefore more dangerous than an airstrike. A bomb could destroy the building and everyone inside it. It could not question a prisoner. It could not separate a captive from a guard. It could not carry away hard drives, mobile telephones, and handwritten ledgers before they burned. The order was to go in. Public accounts identify the assault force as operators from the United States Army's most secretive special mission community, widely reported as Delta Force, supported by American aviation. They launched from Iraq and crossed into Syria, a country where no American ground force publicly occupied the area. Every mile increased the risk. A mechanical failure could leave an aircraft in hostile territory. A wounded man could turn a short raid into a rescue operation. Syrian air defenses, Islamic State lookouts, and the simple chance of a shepherd noticing unusual movement all existed on the same map. Before the first aircraft lifted, intelligence officers had studied the compound as a living system. Who entered, who left, where the guards slept, which building might contain Abu Sayyaf, where women and children were likely to be held. A wall on a photograph was not merely a wall, it was an obstacle, a firing position and a source of fragmentation. A doorway was not merely an entrance. It was a funnel through which one armed man could stop several. The commandos rehearsed the sequence until movement became memory. Land, isolate, breach, identify, capture, collect, leave. 6 verbs. Hundreds of possible failures. The men waiting at Al-Amr had a different advantage. They were already there. They knew the rooms and the paths between them. They could place weapons behind cover and fire toward the sound. If they survived the first seconds, they could force the Americans into a close fight where expensive technology seemed to matter less. That was the theory. At night, however, darkness is not equal. To an unprepared eye, the compound would have dissolved into black shapes. A wall, a roofline, a doorway, then nothing. To men using night vision equipment, the scene became a grainy landscape of contrasts. Heat, Movement and muzzle flashes betrayed positions. Infrared markers invisible to the defenders helped the assault force distinguish one team from another. Aircraft crews could watch approaches that a guard on the ground could not see. Technology did not remove fear. It organized it. Inside a helmet, every breath still sounded too loud. Dust still entered the mouth. A weapon could still jam. A figure could still appear at 3 meters with no uniform and no time for a second judgment. Night vision narrowed the world into a glowing circle, and beyond that circle remained the ancient battlefield. Noise, confusion, and the possibility of death from somewhere unseen. When the helicopters reached the area, surprise was measured in seconds. The first reaction from the compound was not surrender. It was resistance. American officials later said the force was engaged by fighters and that approximately a dozen enemy combatants were killed during the operation. The exact sequence remains classified, and responsible accounts differ on details. What is clear is that this was not an arrest made in a quiet bedroom. The guards fought. Their fire revealed where they were. Muzzle flashes cut through the darkness. Rounds struck walls and threw chips of masonry into the air. The noise inside the compound became physical. Automatic fire, shouted warnings, the concussion of breaching charges, aircraft above, and the sharp metallic clatter of weapons being worked at close range. The Islamic State fighters had expected darkness to hide them. Each shot now marked a position. The assault teams moved through the compound in separate elements. One group fixed the armed defenders. Another pushed toward the structures connected to the target. Others secured the perimeter and watched for reinforcements. Speed mattered, but speed did not mean running blindly. It meant making each decision before the defender could recover from the previous one. Abu Sayyaf was encountered during the fighting. The mission had intended to capture him, but American officials said he resisted and was killed. No public record gives us his final words. Any account that places a polished speech in his mouth is fiction. His actions are enough. He did not behave like a clerk surprised beside a ledger. The man linked to the organization's finances was inside a defended compound, surrounded by armed personnel, and died during close combat with an American assault force. The distinction between Islamic State's administrators and its fighters was thinner than its propaganda suggested. Nearby, Sayyaf was taken alive. Her capture changed the value of the raid. Documents can show what an organization recorded. A knowledgeable prisoner can explain what the records mean. A nickname and a telephone may be meaningless until someone connects it to a face. A column of numbers may look like ordinary accounting until someone identifies the oil field, the courier, or the commander behind it. The Americans also found a young Yazidi woman held captive. Her presence turned an intelligence operation into something more immediate. Islamic State had attacked the Yazidi community around Sinjar in August 2014. Men were murdered. Families were separated. Women and girls were transported, sold, and raped under a system the organization attempted to justify in its own publications. The rescued woman was not an accidental visitor to the compound. Her captivity was evidence of the system. This detail matters because it explains the tactical restraint required that night. An airstrike might have killed Abu Sayyaf. It might also have killed the prisoner beside him and destroyed the material that exposed his network. The commandos had to cross rooms where a person without a weapon might be a captive, a family member, a source, or a threat reaching for something hidden. There is no clean geometry in such a place. One door can contain a gunman, the next, a terrified woman, the third, both. The assault force cleared the compound while specialists gathered what they could carry: laptops, mobile phones, digital storage, paper records, objects that looked mundane under electric light but could reveal a network larger than the buildings around them. This was the second battle of Al-Amr, and it began before the helicopters left. An armed guard can be defeated in a second. A network must be reconstructed one connection at a time. Who called whom after the raid began? Which number suddenly went silent? Which commander changed location the following morning? Which oil broker stopped traveling on his usual road? The answers were hidden not in one heroic document, but in patterns. American officials later described the recovered intelligence as substantial. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter said the operation produced a significant collection. Subsequent reporting indicated that the material helped the coalition understand Islamic State leadership, finances, communications, and the way the group profited from oil. The fighters at the compound had tried to defend a man. Without knowing it, they had also marked the importance of everything around him. This is where the phrase "what they said" becomes more complicated than a quotation. Militant organizations under pressure rarely write honest reviews of the enemy. They do not announce that their security failed. Publicly, they minimize losses, change names, and replace photographs. Privately, their behavior becomes testimony. After Al-Amr, Islamic State personnel had to confront a new fact. A senior official in Syria had been reached by a force launched from outside the country. The Americans had not simply located him. They had landed beside him, fought through his protection, taken his wife, rescued a captive, collected his records, and departed without losing a man. No propaganda department could reverse the sequence. The organization's internal response was therefore practical. Senior figures altered security. Communications were treated with greater suspicion. Meetings, travel patterns, and personal devices became liabilities. The raid demonstrated that a telephone was not merely a telephone. It was a map the owner carried voluntarily. Captured Islamic State members and defectors would later describe a culture increasingly obsessed with spies and tracking. Men were warned about electronic signatures. Couriers regained importance. Leaders moved, separated from families, or avoided predictable locations. Such precautions did not begin with this raid, and not every change can be attributed to one night. But Al-Amr gave the fear a concrete shape. The Americans could come for a person, not merely a position. That psychological difference is enormous. An airstrike threatens a building. A raid threatens a routine. If a commander believes aircraft are hunting a headquarters, he can leave the headquarters. If he believes a ground force can identify him inside an ordinary house, then every driver, every guard, every telephone, and every relative becomes part of the danger. Security expands until it begins to consume the organization it is meant to protect. More guards create more witnesses. More couriers create more links. More movement creates more patterns. Silence slows command. Isolation damages trust. The raid had turned fear into an administrative cost. There was also a military lesson. Islamic State's fighters had built their reputation through aggression. They overwhelmed isolated posts, used vehicle bombs to rupture defensive lines, and exploited opponents who fled before close combat began. Against local units with uncertain leadership, shock often became victory. At Al-Amr, shock moved in the opposite direction. The defenders had the compound. The Americans had the initiative. The defenders knew the ground. The Americans chose the minute. The defenders possessed numbers and cover. The Americans combined intelligence, aviation, night vision, rehearsed violence, and a strict time limit. One side occupied the place. The other controlled the sequence. That is the central advantage of a special operations raid. It does not make a small force invulnerable. It concentrates preparation into a few minutes of extreme local superiority. Months of surveillance become a route through one courtyard. Hours of rehearsal become the angle at which a man enters one doorway. Satellites, analysts, pilots, interpreters, and assault troops converge on a target that may have only seconds to understand what is happening. For the Islamic State guards, those seconds were the whole war. They could not see the intelligence process that had identified the compound. They could not strike the base from which the force launched. They could not know which devices had betrayed them. They saw only silhouettes moving with purpose in a place that was supposed to be secure. And then the silhouettes were gone. The extraction was as dangerous as the entry. A force on the ground grows more vulnerable with every minute. Surprise fades. Nearby fighters can mobilize. Vehicles can block routes. A damaged aircraft can force everyone to remain. The commandos had prisoners, rescued personnel, and bags of material to move, all while accounting for every member of the team. Aircraft lifted from the desert carrying more than the people aboard. They carried fragments of Islamic State's private memory back in secure facilities. Exploitation teams began the patient work. Devices were copied. Documents were translated. Names were compared with existing databases. A contact found in one phone could be matched to a number recovered months earlier in Iraq. A receipt could confirm the importance of an oil installation. A photograph could establish that two men who denied knowing each other had stood in the same room. Sayyaf was questioned in American custody before being transferred to Iraqi Kurdish authorities. She was later prosecuted in Iraq. Investigators also examined her role in the captivity and abuse of Yazidi women, including American hostage Kayla Mueller, who died while held by Islamic State. The legal and intelligence story extended far beyond the compound. For the organization, this was the raid's longest shadow. Dead men keep secrets. Captured records do not. Every fighter who had spoken casually near Abu Sayyaf now had reason to wonder whether his voice existed on a device. Every facilitator who had sent a number now had reason to wonder whether the number had been recovered. Every official who had visited the compound now had reason to wonder whether the number had been recovered. Every official who had visited the compound now had reason to wonder whether the number had been recovered. Every official who had visited the compound now had reason to wonder whether the number had been recovered. Every official who had visited the compound now had reason to wonder whether the number had been recovered. Every official who had visited the compound now had reason to wonder whether the number had been recovered. Every official who had visited the compound now had reason to wonder whether the number had been recovered. Every official who had visited the compound now had reason to wonder whether the number had been recovered. Paranoia requires no public announcement. It spreads through unanswered questions. What did they take? Who was exposed? Who led them here? Those were the most important words Islamic State said after the raid, even if no microphone captured them in a single room. The operation also challenged a comfortable myth about modern Western warfare, that technology had replaced physical courage. The aircraft, surveillance and night vision systems were essential. None could enter the final doorway. At some point, a person still had to cross the threshold knowing an armed man might be waiting on the other side. Delta Force's reputation is often described through equipment and secrecy. Its real method is less cinematic. Selection removes many capable people. Training repeats simple actions under increasingly difficult conditions. Intelligence reduces uncertainty without pretending to eliminate it. Teams rehearse until they can adapt when the plan fails. The result can look effortless only after the danger has been hidden by competence. Al-Amr was not effortless. It was a close-range fight inside hostile territory, launched across an international border, against an enemy that had every reason to resist. The absence of American casualties was not proof that the mission was safe. It was evidence that risk had been studied, distributed, and managed better than the defenders could exploit it. Nor did one raid destroy Islamic State's oil network. The group remained dangerous. It continued to control territory, murder prisoners, and inspire attacks. Its financial system adapted. Other men replaced Abu Sayyaf. No serious account should turn one successful night into the collapse of a caliphate. But special operations are rarely valuable because one target is irreplaceable. They are valuable because a target connects to others. Abu Sayyaf's death removed experience. Sayyaf's capture produced knowledge. The rescued Yazidi woman provided a survivor. The collected material exposed relationships. The method forced leaders to change behavior. Each result amplified the others. This is why the raid was more than a killing mission. Had the objective been only Abu Sayyaf's death, a missile might have been simpler. The men who landed at Al-Amr were there because the United States wanted the organization behind the man. Its habits, its money, its names, its fears. And fear was visible in what followed. Islamic State propaganda presented its territory as a sanctuary, where foreign enemies could bomb but not enter. The night raid broke that image at ground level. Walls had failed, guards had failed, distance had failed. A senior official's household had become an intelligence source. The black flag still flew over towns the next morning, yet something underneath it had changed. The group's leaders now knew that the darkness above the desert might contain aircraft they would hear too late. They knew the first explosion might not be a bomb dropped from far away, but a breach made by men already at the wall. They knew that if those men reached a room, death was not the only danger. Capture was worse. Capture meant questions. Devices opened. Names connected. Private crimes carried into courtrooms. It meant the organization losing control of its own story. There is a temptation to end this account with an invented line from a terrified fighter. A sentence about ghosts, demons, or men who could see in the dark. Such lines travel well online because they compress confusion into myth. The documented truth is colder. When the aircraft arrived, Islamic State fighters fired. When Delta entered, the defenders were killed or overwhelmed. When the force left, it took a prisoner, a rescued slave, and a large intelligence haul. Afterwards, the organization tightened security and lived with the uncertainty of what had been exposed. No legend is required. Their resistance said they believed the target mattered. Their losses said they could not protect him. Their precautions said they expected the Americans to return. And the Americans did return, in other places, on other nights, against other names. Raids and strikes became part of a campaign that narrowed the space in which Islamic State leaders could move openly. Each operation depended on intelligence from previous operations. A captured phone led to a courier led to a house led to another device. The battlefield became a chain of doors. Al-Amr was one of those doors. Before midnight, Abu Sayyaf compound represented control. Armed men watched the approaches. Records accumulated inside. Captives remained unseen. The desert appeared to separate the organization from the forces hunting it. By dawn, the guards were dead. Abu Sayyaf was gone. His wife was in custody. A Yazidi woman was free, and the contents of his hidden world were flying toward a room full of analysts. That is what Islamic State fighters said after facing Delta Force at night. Not in a speech. In the alarms they failed to give early enough. In the gunfire that revealed their positions. In the files they could not destroy. In the security measures adopted after the helicopters disappeared. They said the night was no longer theirs.